Hi everyone! Welcome back to Current Affairs Unfiltered. I'm your host, Paige Pullman. We are back with another solo episode, but today we have a special guest interview on the back end with Phil Andrew. If you recall, Phil is running in Illinois 9, and I had him on in November to talk about more of his platform, but Phil is also a national security expert, so I decided to bring him back on to talk a little bit about what ICE has been doing and how it relates to national security and how it actually makes us not so safe. So stay tuned for that at the end. And if you're just here for Phil's portion, in the show notes there should be a timestamp with where that begins. But as for this week's news, there was quite a few things going on, from Pam Bondi having a meltdown live on TV, to the Kristi Noem takedown article in the Wall Street Journal, to the Washington Post, to Trump politicizing the military again. It's a few things to get through, but I kept it brief this time because, of course, we have Phil at the end. So let's get into it. We're going to start off strong with Pam Bondi testifying in front of Congress. I'm sure at this point you've seen clips of it. The whole thing was just a hot mess, I think is the best way to describe it. Most people in his government are just uniquely unqualified for the positions that they hold, but Pam Bondi is somehow even worse. And if you recall, Pam Bondi was in charge of the Casey Anthony trial. If you recall, again, Casey Anthony walked free. So that's the person that we're dealing with, is somebody who was already inept at the job they had before they were inept at the job that Trump gave them. So Bondi was there to testify about the Epstein stuff, which obviously, Trump does not want her gabbing about, which, fine, that's his prerogative. But she, in the court of public opinion, the Epstein files are very popular. By that I mean everybody wants them released. Everybody wants everything unredacted, less the victims' names and any photos of them that might be in there. But wanting to hold these people accountable is a big thing. As I talked about in my last whole episode, across the world, people are being held accountable, but in the US, people are just, nothing's happening. Nothing's happening to the people in the files. So I think for her to get up there and be as combative as she was just makes the situation worse for Trump. And, even just watching some of the clips, she was so clearly performing for an audience of one. And by audience of one, I mean Donald Trump himself. She had this this whole line of attack where somebody asked her something. She was just so combative. And the most viral video that went around was her screaming about the Dow, but she was speaking so incoherently about it. You can hear her start to say, the Dow is over 50,000. And then she says, duh. And she's clearly going to say dollars. But the Dow was in fact measured in points. So I don't think she even has the background to understand what she was saying. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but she went in there with prepared things to say. And this particular thing seems like something that Donald Trump handed over to her. But here's the clip. Let me know what you think.
Is that, you know why? Because Donald Trump, the Dow right now is over. The Dow is over $50,000. I don't know why you're laughing. You're a great stock trader, as I hear, Raskin. The Dow is over 50,000 right now. The S&P at almost 7,000. The NASDAQ smashing records. Americans' 401ks and retirement savings are booming.
Anyways, keep in mind, this was a questioning over her handling of the Epstein documents, and she is responding to questions by talking about the market and saying, essentially, you heard it in that clip, forget about all of this. We should just be talking about how strong the economy is. The economy is being propped up by 4 people and AI. That's it. Anyways, she then refused to apologize to Epstein victims for their handling of the Epstein files. And overall, I think this just showed just how incompetent she is. And also, I don't think it, quote unquote, fixed the problem. People are pissed about the Epstein files stuff, and she is continuing to evade because she's performing for Donald Trump. And it's hard to see if she even feels bad about what she did. It's hard to imagine she does. She doesn't seem like somebody that has a soul. But testifying in front of Congress is supposed to be a form of accountability. But when you are dealing with people that don't deal with facts, first of all, and that don't care to be accountable to the public, it doesn't work. And, like I said, I don't think this works in her favor with the American public, but whatever. The other thing that happened was her having her apparent burn book where she had names of members and lines of attack for, I want to say, close to every member. She was flipping through the pages so fervently and frequently that a photographer present at the hearing got a picture of the page for Representative Jayapal where it literally has so members of the House and Senate were able to go in and look at unredacted Epstein files. And Representative Jayapal had gone in and looked at certain records. And in Pam Bondi's burn book was the list of documents she chose to look at unredacted. I'm sorry. That's not okay. I mean, yeah, they have a record of it, but to go digging in there? And arguably, Representative Jayapal was looking at some of the most incriminating ones, such as the one that said, "Thank you for a fun night. Your littlest girl was a little naughty." Yeah, I'd want to see who sent that email too. Next question. But it's very clear nothing she said up there was her own original thoughts. All of it was just fed to her by who knows who. I'm going to say people in Donald Trump's office, but like she has no spine. She has no spine. And keep in mind, before she was nominated, the option was Matt Gaetz. I can't imagine that Matt Gaetz would have done any better or worse in this situation. And at this point, I mean, not to just like say that this doesn't matter, because it does. Because this pattern of treating congressional oversight, which is what this is supposed to be, that is what congressional hearings are supposed to do. They're supposed to provide some sort of oversight and check. And Pam Bondi and the Trump administration at large is treating it as political theater instead of the constitutional check that it is. That's what's worrisome about this. Not to mention, as I said, the fact that they are keeping tabs on what these Congress people are looking at in the Epstein files. Crazy. Let's move on to Donald Trump's other worst woman in charge, Kristi Noem. Actually, she might be the first worst woman in charge. Pam Bondi is probably number 2. They're both like evil though. But this bombshell article came out in the Wall Street Journal this week, and just talking about, one, the relationship between Kristi Noem and Corey Lewandowski, he was instrumental in Trump's first campaign and has always kind of stayed in the Trump orbit, very close with Trump. But their whole kind of relationship and how that came to be, as well as just the way that because it's not even just Kristi, it's they as a team are running DHS. Now, this article is behind a paywall, which is honestly disappointing because I had a Wall Street Journal subscription that I got because I had a friend who did some sort of work with the Wall Street Journal, but she quit, so my subscription got canceled, obviously. So then I had to use my boyfriend's phone to read it, and what I didn't do was take screenshots and send them to myself like I should have. But I took notes. If you'd like to read this, go find yourself a friend that does business with the Wall Street Journal, or find your boyfriend and get screenshots off his phone. But I'll give you the rough overview of what it said. I mean, I guess, okay, let's start with the bombshell part of it. So the paragraphs that caught the most attention were arguably the sillier ones, like the fact that Corey Lewandowski / Kristi Noem, at this point they're one and the same, fired a pilot because they were on a plane. They had to switch planes because there was an issue. And the pilot left Kristi Noem's blanket on the first flight, the one that they weren't going to be flying with. Corey Lewandowski then fired this pilot. But then, on their way home, we fired him and he was like, you know what, find your own transportation home. They had to hire him back because there was nobody else to fly them back home except for the guy that they just fired. That was one of the ones that got the most attention. The part that I found the most alarming was the fact that Corey Lewandowski, this is like a 2-part story. Corey Lewandowski is classified as a special government employee. If you recall, that is what Elon Musk was when he was running Doge. It is meant for private sector employees to come in and do projects for the federal government, and they're limited to 130 days in a year. Corey Lewandowski is classified as a special government employee because he wanted to be Noem's like second in command. And Donald Trump, who was sketched out, frankly, by the relationship between Noem and Lewandowski, was like That's not happening. You're not being her second in command. Like, you can be a special government employee. That's all you get. So he is only a special government employee. Therefore, he can only work for 130 days in a year at DHS. He was falsifying his badge swipes, like asking other people to badge him into the building so that it didn't count as a day of him working. And on top of that, he was begging people to get a gun and badge authorized by the government. Hello? And then firing people that weren't authorizing him the gun. And then when asked about it, the DHS spokesperson was like, don't know what you're talking about. It didn't happen. He has apparently gotten the badge. Don't know on the gun situation, but he has the badge as a special government employee. Why? I'd love to be in his mind, because what makes you think, as a person that is not even employed full-time by the government, gives you the authority to wield a weapon in the name of the government? That's the part that I found the most alarming. But the part that was all over social media was the story about the pilot in the blanket. But overall, the article just talks about the management dysfunction and the just berating of top-level officials. They, as in Noem and Lewandowski, allegedly demoted or fired roughly 80% of ICE's career field leadership, which caused a great deal of concern about agency stability. There was also an interesting tidbit where some sort of policy that Noem had put in place was about any contract over X amount of dollars she had to sign off on, and she let a contract sit on her desk for a whole bunch of steel for so long that by the time she actually signed it, the price of steel for the amount that they needed had gone up $100 million. Talk about waste, fraud, and abuse. That's culprit number one. Not that she could predict the, cost of steel, but what are you doing? You're just hanging out with Corey Lewandowski too much? You can't sign the contract? And the other thing that I found kind of interesting was this kind of power struggle between, backtrack again. Lewandowski lobbied for Noem to have this position because it was such an integral part of Trump's agenda. And essentially what Lewandowski is doing is teeing her out for a presidential run, which is why all those commercials were coming out about her. And what the article revealed was that Trump was like, why is this lady on my TV all the time? Like, he was equally confused, allegedly, about these commercials. So this was supposed to be a tee up for a presidential run. But you know who else is a, known face and name in DHS right now is Tom Homan. So, as if Tom Homan is running for president, but whatever. Noem and Homan have had just an internal kind of power struggle. They kind of have said that Homan is too weak on immigration. He's still crazy, but sure. But if she saw Tom Homan on TV, she would berate her staff, and she also kept track of their TV appearances to see who was getting the most airtime. To be that narcissistic is crazy. A DHS spokesperson told the Wall Street Journal that claim was false. There's more in the article. I will link it in the show notes. Like I said, it is behind a paywall, and I no longer have a Wall Street Journal subscription. If somebody listening would like to gift that to me, give me your little login, that would be fantastic. I'd love to get back on the Wall Street Journal. But before we move on, the whole thing, again, this just goes back to the Pam Bondi thing. Like, the whole thing is concerning, and I don't want to make it seem like it's not concerning. But to me, the most concerning aspect here is Corey Lewandowski and the fact that he's a special government employee, but is lying to be one. And on top of that, just the extreme lack of leadership. Like, we know she's not qualified for this job. That's fine. But how are you fumbling it this badly? And I think part of it is, like I said in the article, it mentioned that 80% of career field staff were demoted or fired. Typically, when you start a new job in the government that high up, the wheels are already turning. There are people there. Those career employees are supposed to be able to help you with the processes that you might not be familiar with. And that doesn't exist anymore. So for that reason, it shouldn't be that shocking that the lack of leadership is this bad, but it somehow makes it worse. Not to mention Kristi Noem and Corey Lewandowski allegedly being in a relationship, even though both of them are married and both of them deny the allegations. Donald Trump has told other people, this is sketching me out. I don't like this. So, TBD. Now, onto the Washington Post. If you recall, the Washington Post was bought by none other than Jeff Bezos, Mr. Amazon himself, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so, 12 years ago. And everyone kind of was like, oh, whatever. I don't remember there being that much. I think there was a little bit of outrage because these big billionaires shouldn't be owning media companies, but it didn't really I think, hit people how bad it was until the 2024 election when he kind of put his thumb on the scale and said, we're not endorsing any candidate. But the Washington Post last week had a massive round of layoffs with over 700 employees losing their jobs, including, I think it was like the entire sports department. A lot of the foreign desks were fired. And what it ultimately leads to is fewer investigations, less local coverage, and weaker accountability. And for any like frame of reference, the Watergate scandal was broken by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein in a department that was just laid off. That story started in the like local DC department because it started as just 4 guys that were arrested in DC and ballooned into this huge thing. And now that entire department is gone. And also, I don't even know if this needs to be said out loud, but the billionaires are not coming to save us. Jeff Bezos could have saved the Washington Post with his pocket change. He could have funded the Washington Post for years to come on his pocket change. And he didn't. Instead, he laid off 700 people. And it doesn't even need repeating at this point, but media is capitulating. We know that. We saw it in the Washington Post in the run-up to the 2024 election. Firing 700 journalists and capturing and hollowing out the media ecosystem benefits the people that are already in power, including the billionaires like Jeff Bezos and President Trump. You know, I'm not trying to make the insinuation that this was somehow Trump putting his thumb on the scale at Washington Post, but I think this is to say that our media is in trouble. I understand people don't like legacy media. It is a touchy subject. I find myself reading more and more Substack articles than I am reading legacy media, but I do still rely on them for some of the in-depth kind of investigative journalism, like that article on Kristi Noem in the Wall Street Journal. As media companies are being brought into these larger conglomerates owned by billionaires, this is something to fear, that these legacy media, legacy news places are going to be hollowed out, and that's not good, period. No matter how much you hate legacy media, that's not good. We need a strong media ecosystem, whether it be independent journalists and established media and the news we watch on TV. You need an ecosystem, and part of that ecosystem is legacy media. I don't think there's more to follow up on that story, just that I'm a little bit dumbstruck, but like the fallout after that was like it's just awful. Like it cannot be stated enough that Jeff Bezos could have put enough money into the Washington Post to run it for 5 years using the change in his couch cushions. And he didn't. He laid off 700 people instead. Moving on, Donald Trump went to Fort Bragg. You know, it's never good when he's at a military base. He was there to talk to the soldiers, as a president does. What do you think he did? What do you think he did? I'll give you like 5 seconds to guess. Correct. He politicized it. He politicized it. So, essentially, the president's not supposed to politicize the military. Trump got to Fort Bragg, got on the stage, and then told them to vote Republican, and it was run like one of his rallies, not like a speech that you are supposed to give to your troops. It was spoken like he was at a rally. Does anyone remember the last time he was at the military base and he was like, keep the fat ones out of the camera shot? God. Anyways, again, I don't even think I need to go into why this isn't okay. You're not supposed to politicize the military. Sorry, the president is not supposed to politicize the military. And doing a political speech at a military base is not just inappropriate, it's dangerous. I mean, it's pushing the guardrails. As I've said in like 6 episodes at this point, there are no guardrails anymore. The guardrails are gone. We're flying off the cliff. But if this was standing by itself, giving a political speech to our service members is pushing the guardrails. Let me tell you why it's important to have an apolitical military. Yes, I mean, I know the stereotype is that a lot of our military members are Republican. There are quite a few that are Democrats, but the stereotype is that they're a bunch of Republican, like, yeehaw type shit. That's fine. The point of the military is to be able to carry out orders regardless of the party that's in charge and not really ask that many questions of it. Yes, the whole Mark Kelly thing about, you know, you don't have to follow legal orders, that is true. But at the end of the day, the military is a little bit of a pressure and peer pressure kind of box, in my opinion. So you don't want to politicize them because you're not going to be happy when 4 years from now, President Gavin Newsom is standing in front of the military and going, vote Democrat. Are you kidding me? Republicans would lose their ever-loving minds. They are not supposed to be a political machine because they are supposed to protect all citizens, regardless of party. I know Donald Trump has personally said that he doesn't want to protect Democrats. That's fine. That's not what our military is supposed to do. It's supposed to be military for all of us. All of us. Donald Trump apparently doesn't think so. And I am honestly so stunned that he is not listening to anyone, if there is anyone in his orbit telling him that that's not okay, but whatever. But on the Mark Kelly thing, that was a whole thing. Pete Hegseth tried to demote Mark Kelly, and then he tried to reduce his pension payments, and then he tried to indict him, and none of it worked. None of it worked. Pete Hegseth was like, we're gonna try to overturn it. It's not happening. Do you know how easy it is to indict somebody? It is ridiculously easy. The bar is so low to actually indict somebody for something, and this administration has failed repeatedly to indict people, meaning that their lack of evidence is so egregious that they cannot get the indictment. Yeah. So that's one positive, is Mark Kelly gets to keep being Mark Kelly. Pete Hegseth, again, another incompetent person at their job. He is the Fox and Friends weekend host, suddenly turned Secretary of Defense, that is playing pretend with real established career military officials that probably think that he is gum on the bottom of their shoe. And he's essentially playing dress up. I'm sorry. Pete Hegseth is playing dress up. He wants to be the big strong man in the room, commanding the army, sending the fighter planes to blow up civilians, and he's just weak. He is surrounded by people that are soaked in their career, in honor, in oath, and he is so small next to them. So small. And I hope every day when he walks into work, because he couldn't get that indictment, the generals all hate him. I hope he feels as small as I know he is. But all that to say, the ruling is a good thing. So yay for that. Last thing I want to talk about before we get to Phil's portion is the governor's dinner. This was a weird back and forth. So first, the governor's dinner happens once a year. All the governors from all 50 states are invited to come and hang out with the president, and they talk about the nation and, I don't know, whatever stuff governors talk about. That's not really the point of the story. So first, Donald Trump invites all of the Republican governors, which, shitty thing to do, but very predictable because it's Donald Trump. Then there was a whole bunch of outrage, obviously, because what are you doing only inviting half of the country's governors? Then he backtracks and he says some Democrats will be invited. Okay. But then, because it was only so first he said some, and I'm like, oh, obviously he's not going to invite J.B. Pritzker, he's not going to invite Gavin Newsom, he's not going to invite Janet Mills, the people that he's publicly kind of sparred with. No, the people that were not invited were Wes Moore of Maryland and Jared Polis of Colorado. Sorry, I mean, not to shit on Wes Moore and Jared Polis, but I don't think they've been publicly sparring with Trump the way that some of these other people that did end up on the invite list have been sparring with him. That seems like some sort of power move, maybe. I don't know. If somebody has the backstory on why the Maryland and Colorado governors were not invited, would love to know, because I saw those names and I said, huh? What did they ever do to you besides be Democrats? Whatever. Anyways, then in his backtrack announcement of changing his mind and saying Democrats can come, Trump posts to Truth Social and says, I look forward to seeing the Republican governors and some of the Democratic governors who were worthy of being invited. Right. So I go back to my original point of what makes Wes Moore and Jared Polis not worthy, as Gavin Newsom is literally making fun of him on Twitter, and my own governor, J.B. Pritzker, is being kind of useless right now, quite frankly. Still love my favorite billionaire, love that guy, but I'm not, a little confused on his angling. Whatever. Those are people that are gunning for the 2028 presidential election, and would make sense for Trump to be like, no, you can't come to my party. Wes Moore and Jared Polis? Anyways, we're done. This just, I think, goes, again, I'm not trying to make light of it because this is so egregious, because this is showing that having personal grievances, apparently, with the governors of Maryland and Colorado are being elevated to a governing principle. And they shouldn't be. Again, I think that goes without saying, but they shouldn't be. At that point, I'm just beating a dead horse. I think this is it for the news. These last 2 weeks were weird. I think my favorite part was just all the news stories coming out. There's been some good reporting coming out lately. So I think we're at the phase of this administration where people are willing to speak to journalists, which is awesome. We saw it a little bit coming out of the DOD, but like now it's starting to spread other places, which is so awesome for people interested in following what's going on behind closed doors. But yeah, that's it on the news front. And my interview with Phil Andrew about ICE and their tactics and what it means and what accountability could look like is coming up right now. Phil, thank you so much for coming back on. It is great to see you again.
Glad to be with you.
Of course. So, as I'm sure you have seen in the news and everybody has seen in the news, ICE is on a rampage, to put it lightly. So we're going to be talking about what people can do. What are we looking at? What is the situation? What are things that could be done to improve the situation? So let's start through a public safety lens. When you're looking at the current ICE operations that are going on, especially in Minneapolis, through a public safety lens, what do you think the real risks are that are being introduced right now for civilians, agents, and also local law enforcement?
Yeah. First, thanks for having me. And this is such an important topic. One, I don't see how this is contributing to public safety in the way that it is being deployed and the strategy that's being used. When we think about public safety generally, what we look for in its most healthy aspects is that there's a highest level of cooperation, that we see state, federal, local law enforcement coordinated very highly themselves, and that they're working with the community to build a trusted relationship, because often the community is the best source of information for where those risks lie. And if there is a priority subject or target for law enforcement, often the community is in the best place to provide insight into where those folks might be and their current activities. So that's the kind of the template that is most effective and that we work to create everywhere where we see public safety threats.
Right. Well, and, some of the articles coming out about how police calls to certain neighborhoods have dropped, and they're reporting, oh, there's lower crime, when that's not actually the reality. It's that people are not calling the police because they fear that ICE will show up with them. Like, that's not protecting public safety.
Yes, this is now a circumstance where we have complete broken trust. And unfortunately, now domestic violence and other crimes and criminal activity that puts people at grave risk and actually gives them no outlet for avoiding that has been created. And we saw this sort of in its making, right? The more we learn about how ICE has been stood up, how this $145 billion over 2 or 3 years is being utilized. One, to recruit people through television ads and digital messaging at gun shows and NASCAR racing. And then the recruitment process, how abbreviated, and the anomalies around incomplete background checks. And then third, the abridged training, that they are not spending enough time training and building the kind of skills and the culture and the understanding of the law and the Constitution, and then seeing the way they're hurriedly deployed and in ways that aren't focused on a particular threat, but rather sort of a roundup. They're actually creating the public safety threat. That the deployment of ICE and ICE being in your community creates greater risk for your community than if they weren't there.
Absolutely. And from your experience in crisis management, what happens when enforcement strategies rely on fear and speed and surprise rather than a predictable strategy and de-escalation, like we are seeing in Minneapolis and like we saw in Chicago?
Yeah. What we see is it is completely destructive to the entire public safety ecosystem. And like you said, we see a drop off in reporting that has nothing to do with lower crime, that has to do with people being fearful of contacting law enforcement at any level, and it forces them to deal with that more interpersonally. And that's the worst circumstance for public safety. And it's bad for our national security because so often the best sources for information of other threats to communities come from the community. And having been a national security professional for 21 years, we relied heavily on sources that we were able to build a trusted relationship with and were willing to share insights into what trends and sometimes what individuals were creating the greatest vulnerabilities.
Right, absolutely. And you touched on this a little bit, but these actions by ICE agents, they're making communities less safe. But how do these actions change the behavior of communities? What are you seeing about that is causing the likelihood of violence and chaos to be greater?
Yes. Well, one of the thing is that because these agents aren't using what we would describe as a best practice around interaction, they're not de-escalating. They are closing distance with protesters in many cases who are not creating any kind of public safety risk. They're actually staying within the law of what we should be tolerant of in terms of protest. Um, that creates the greater chance that there will be conflict. And on the other side, there's just increased pressure among the community to try to do what it feels like it can to protect itself and protect those members. And so that also requires a great deal of restraint. And that you cannot have that without a great deal of training. I'll just kind of point to the civil rights movement when nonviolence and civil protest was used as a tool for social change. The individuals involved in that were willing to go through weeks of training that really required a great deal of courage and strength and self-control so that they weren't creating the public safety risk and they weren't attracting the enforcement action or an attack, but rather they were passive. And what it demonstrated was the complete illegal, unconstitutional, and immoral attack on those individuals. But it took a great deal of training. And, in classic Keynesian nonviolence, it actually recognizes that nonviolence requires greater strength and courage than violence does.
Right, absolutely. And it's, even the videos that we've seen coming out of Minneapolis have been so jarring, I think, because a lot of the protesters that are being attacked, murdered, got pepper sprayed, whatever it is, so often they are just standing there recording, which is part of what makes it so dystopian when we see these attacks because they're not doing anything. They're not being disruptive. They're standing there recording and they just get attacked, if
Yes.
not murdered.
And I think what we're seeing here is that these agents are starting to realize that the greatest threat to them is the video, because that means potential future accountability. And they know that at some point in the future, that the digital evidence will be matched with those carefully captured and narrated videos, and that the evidence of abuse and unconstitutional behavior is going to be incontrovertible in front of a jury, in front of a body that is there to provide that accountability. And I think it creates a great deal of fear. So they don't want that. And I would suspect, I don't know this as a fact, but I would suspect that given the culture that's been created, that's actually being internally discussed, that they want to create the kind of fear and intimidation to dissuade and disrupt those from capturing a static video.
Right, absolutely. And how do you pair that with the fact that now they're saying, Kristi Noem is saying, oh, well, we're going to wear body cams. Do you believe that? And if you do you think that will kind of help some of the problems that we're seeing?
Well, unfortunately, the director or the secretary has lost a complete credibility. She has said and done things that are unbelievable, and the
Right.
facts do not back up. And she's doubled down on that. So that has put her in a position where we cannot believe anything she says. And this is almost a little too late. The idea of requiring body cameras after this has happened, and then what they will require in terms of training of when those body cameras are turned on, what they will record, how that information will be stored and provided, and will it be subject to independent review? All of those things remain unanswered. But what we do know is when the court has asked for that information, it has gone missing or has been unavailable. And in some cases where it has been provided, it provides an insight into um, a lack of command control, a lack of professionalism, and in some cases, deep bias, even before the altercations began.
Right. Well, that was kind of my biggest fear is they made this whole announcement of, oh, we're going to require body cameras now, but it's, as you said, like that's not the whole story. There's so many other things that go into requiring body cameras. Like my biggest one is where does the footage go after that? And are you going to make it easy for people to access? Because my guess, given the total lack of accountability here, is that no, you are not going to make it easy to access and make it a policy that's worthwhile. And like you talked about earlier, trying to dissuade people from recording, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are like, oh, well, I won't record because they have body cameras on, like they're catching the whole thing. But
Mhm.
it's still just as important to record on your own devices.
Yes. And we're also seeing hints because there's significant reporting about the internal conflict within Homeland Security, that there does seem to be some that are pushing back on this non compliant, these unconstitutional efforts. That there does seem to be some conflict within the agency that the secretary is trying to overcome with strong public statements that don't recognize that there's internal conflict about what they're doing, how they're doing it, and what the orders are for each deployment and the agents participating in it.
Right. So you talked a little bit about the fact that there is just seems to be no attempt at de-escalation. You yourself have trained people on how to de-escalate high-risk situations. What core de-escalation principles and tactics are being ignored in how these operations are being carried out?
Well, it starts with your training. You can't put people on the street with an abbreviated training and expect them to perform professionally. But it also starts with who you recruit. So all of those anomalies in the build out of the expansion of ICE and the agency, I think contribute to the problem. But for agencies that make a cultural commitment to public safety that includes the ability to give the tool to law enforcement and enforcement officials to have the tool of de-escalation, it's proven to be incredibly effective. And it requires a prioritization of that training being something that you're going to invest in. I suspect that that's not part of their current training regimen because it doesn't show on the street in their behavior, and it doesn't show in the culture that is there to hold them accountable. In many cases, there is backing up of escalating behavior instead of holding it accountable.
Right. And one of the things that a lot of people have said is, it's because of these abbreviated training timelines. In the murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, the agents that committed those murders had, I think, between 8 and 12 years of service to ICE and DHS. How do you kind of reconcile those two things? Like, does it point to a larger sign of rot? Were these just people that had previously were just bad people and now they have the permission to escalate the way they want? How do you kind of work those two things together?
Well, I think once we look at the service records and the complaints that may have been issued, the personnel records of those particular agents, I think it's going to be very telling. What I find in post-incident investigations that there usually is a very well-established pattern of behavior that demonstrates itself and that allows for intervention. When you see somebody breaking rules and using language and not using de-escalation in repeated situations, that's an early warning that this isn't somebody that you can count on to elevate public safety in a critical incident. And if the right kind of oversight, compliance, oversight to hold people in accountable for it isn't done, you end up keeping these people for many years. And we see that as an anomaly within law enforcement agencies that don't have a culture of rooting out their worst actors. And that tends to affect the entire agency. Even if there's others that don't participate, that the sheer idea that people aren't held accountable for bad behavior tends to really ruin morale and create a culture of acceptance of bad behavior. And a lot of police departments around the country, there's 18,000 different law enforcement agencies. The vast majority have accepted this as a best practice and elevate that training to make sure they're meeting the public safety need. This is one that in my estimation hasn't done that and doesn't show a willingness to even try.
Right. Well, not to mention, I think it was earlier this week, a couple emails came out about the ICE agent that had shot the woman in Chicago, and Greg Bovino is emailing him and going, "Nice job." That is literally a culture of zero accountability. There was no shunning. It was, in fact, welcoming further into the fold. That's, I think, the part that's most shocking to me, and I think speaks so close to your point.
And the other statements made in and around the shooting showed that there was a mindset that they were looking for a conflict and not judging the behavior and the threat in a reasonable way. They brought a high level of bias because they wanted a conflict. And that's unprofessional, immoral, and bad for law enforcement, bad for communities. And that's why we saw an outcome like that. And it's tragic. And that's why we need people right now to be electing them to Congress that have the specific skill set that is able to hold administrations like this and departments like this and agencies like this accountable. And the most important thing is that recognizing that often accountability is delayed, that our system of justice, once restored and faith in it returned, which is going to take time, it does provide for that reasonable analysis that allows us away from the crisis to hold people accountable based on the facts. And that's going to be really important for healing in our country, as well as holding people accountable in a way that restores trust in law enforcement and the systems that promote public safety.
Right. One of the things that I've kind of been grappling with is that oftentimes when there's scandals and crimes in U.S. government, the people at the very top will often evade accountability. We think about Watergate, the people at the top got pardons. We think about Iran-Contra, same thing. The people that were at the top of the power chain got pardons, while the people at the bottom are the ones that actually face consequences. Do you see that being the case here, or is that a concern of yours when we're looking at accountability? Should people be tempering their expectations around one day seeing Kristi Noem in handcuffs?
Well, one, I think the most important thing is us to hold accountable our agencies and then restore their ability to provide that oversight and accountability. And that has been degraded incredibly fast. This administration removed every inspector general at every level of government almost immediately after taking office. And that is setting back decades worth of best practice on early indications of fraud, waste, abuse, and corruption. So we first need to restore faith in the very institutions that would be holding these individuals accountable. And I think that is critical in this moment because we are so divided. And there is so little faith in government and government's ability to provide for accountability. So that's why I would prioritize that to have credibility in holding them accountable. I think that we need a Congress that is going to come in and commit to the ethical reforms that are required to restore faith, extend that to every branch of the federal government, restore the inspector generals, and then institute the reforms that go deeper than even where we were before this administration, because we've struggled with the independence and perceptions of independence, whether it be the Supreme Court, Justice, the FBI, and many agencies, and then work toward accountability, because the big work around some of the biggest problems we face, whether it be climate change, health, and the basic underlying facts of science, we have to restore faith that we have, that our agencies have credibility and that they're applying those facts to policymaking that restores American trust in our institutions. Because as long as we have a low-level trust in government, politicians, and the impact that government and our agencies can have, we are going to stumble and not be effective in addressing things like climate change, healthcare, disease, as well as many of the other huge problems in this global environment that we find ourselves.
So speaking of the global environment, from an international security standpoint, what signal does it send when immigration enforcement begins to resemble a domestic military operation? And how does that affect U.S. credibility and stability abroad?
Boy, there's so many layers to it. One, it shows that we are not living our values. Two, it degrades our ability to respond to real threats. With a lot of national security and federal law enforcement being distracted to what is a relatively minor public safety issue, meaning migrants here illegally that are committing violent crimes. That is a very small percentage of the threat to public safety that the U.S. experiences. And that should be done, as I've said, in high collaboration with state, federal, local law enforcement, as well as building trust with the communities. Secondly, one of our greatest sources of good intelligence and insights into both public safety threats and national security threats are from the diverse migrant population and people that come to the United States. And we are degrading that by creating this division between our agencies and those that could provide us that information. And finally, it really leaves us in a place that this was a space that we had a lot of moral authority and credibility, but that with degrading our soft power and our ability to help those in other countries that are experiencing threat, intimidation, violence, famine, disease. The U.S. previously had a strategy that was working to help those populations, to help make sure that we were seen as the country that helps build schools, hospitals, and helps you in a time of need. And because we've pulled back from those, it's created more urgency and contributed to migrant patterns.
Stay with us, we're bringing a couple.
And now we've got this anomaly where we're actually fighting it on our streets here when we're creating greater need and impetus for that.
Right. Well, and that's, I don't think a lot of people know what the term soft power is unless you are, some sort of familiar within the U.S. government. But soft power is what kept the U.S. as being this big player on the world stage. We think about the rock music, like that was soft power. We think about USAID, that was a form of soft power. And without things like that, we're creating a more unsafe situation for ourselves. As you said, like we're not getting the information that we once got. And unfortunately, the effects of that won't be seen for a few years down the line, which I think makes it even more critical now to reinvest in stuff like that as soon as we can.
Yes. The interruption to our natural systems and healthy systems is going to take years to recreate and rebuild this trust, both with immigrant populations and with whole communities that are legal here, but are
Right.
fearful and do not see law enforcement potentially as coming to their aid, but adding to the crisis. And the credibility lost overseas is going to take years to repair. So, but the most important thing is, as I see this, and one of the reasons I'm running is because the next 2 years are going to be critical. And we have the potential of sending the largest class of new Congress people in this election cycle. And they need to have the kind of background, skills, and experience that is relevant to precisely this. Otherwise, we don't have the opportunity to take on some of these larger challenges. And the health of our institutions, their independence and their ability to function to support liberty, the ability to vote, the ability to find and support facts, so real decisions can be made that are effective and not biased by money or ideology. We're moving into an information age where the credibility of those that gather and support information is critical.
So, looking beyond the immediate moment, what are the long-term consequences for public safety, intelligence gathering, and community trust if the current approach of ICE continues?
It is going to be destructive, and that's why it needs to stop. That's why we need people who understand how to hold it accountable and repair the systems that have been impacted. And that's going to take time. And it's also going to require a new generation of young people who are smart and honor bound and willing to take an oath that really honors their commitment to the Constitution and the rule of law, to step into those spaces and bring their service to their country. And I think we need to create the conditions. And I think that what makes that attractive is when people believe the fix isn't in. And for me, that work starts in this election. It starts with the Democratic Party. It starts with holding each other accountable. And that is one of the issues in this campaign today, that there are other candidates that are leveraging dark money and not being transparent about where they're getting it. They're running for more than one office at the same time, which I think degrades our ability to build the bench. If I wear two hats, that means you can't wear one and you are disenfranchised from participating. And I think that's one of the key things that we need to recognize, that we lead by first managing ourselves in the most effective, the most honorable, the most ethical and effective ways, and holding ourselves accountable, and then turning to hold those around us in this space to go to Congress and do this. And if that's the opportunity, and it's a unique opportunity because of the way this district, the 9th, is designed and how this race with multiple candidates is developing, but it's also happening across the country where we're seeing folks with military, law enforcement, and intelligence backgrounds stepping up to continue to follow through on that oath that they took, that honorable oath to serve something bigger than themselves and not self-deal, not profit, and not insidiously use one population and voter set against another just to gather power.
Sing it, Phil. You're speaking my language. I just got chills while you were talking. Incredibly disheartening to see people try to profit off of running in general, but it's even more disheartening to me in this race. Like, this is not the community that I thought I was a part of. This is not the machine that I thought was here in the 9th district. And, it makes me sad. But,
Yeah.
I think you're right. This district and the country deserves leaders that have that background, have that skill set, are stepping up to the plate, especially because they have taken that oath, because they understand how the government works. They understand how it is, in theory, supposed to function and how it should what it should look like when reforms are done.
Yes. And it's so much the corruption that we're battling, we cannot have accepted it or participated in it before.
Right.
And I think
Right.
that this district, as much of the Chicago and Illinois, having been under the stranglehold of Madigan and Burke and some of these decade-long grips of corruption, that folks that grew up in that system don't fully appreciate that they have adopted many of the practices that continue it. And as insidious as the idea of running for 2 offices and using the campaign funds from a state committee to try to help you get elected, those are old school kind of petty corruptions that degrade your ability to reach Congress and have clear sight on
Right.
what needs to be done and how to do it. But it also tells to the electorate that you have to accept some level of corruption. You have to hold your nose, and we just sort of accept it. You know, when we talk about Illinois politics, we talk about Chicago politics, people are like, oh, the fix is in. And we laugh and we shrug. But this is a moment that it actually matters. And the only way we can bring accountability and oversight to this administration and restore faith in our government is to elevate those things and make sure we honor them even in electoral process.
Right. Right. Absolutely. So one last question for you, not to put you into a bad space mentally, but if you were advising leadership right now, for some reason, Donald Trump has contacted you and said, Phil, I need you to come in and fix a couple things up. So if you were advising leadership right now, what would you say should be stopped immediately? And what would a safer, more effective approach look like in practice?
If we're talking specifically around ICE, I think mandating that any ICE action be required to be done in collaboration with state, local, and federal authorities. Because one, they have the greatest breadth of insight into what the public safety challenges are. They have the highest likelihood of either knowing the community and having a relationship with the community, or at least establishing that relationship with the community where you can build insight into where to address that public safety threat. And that's how it used to be done. And a lot of effort and investment went into building task forces and building strong credibility among agencies and with the community. So that would be the most important thing that could be done. If they felt like they still had to go ahead with doing this, but also recognizing that if you take an evidence-based approach, a real data-driven approach to public safety, you'll recognize that there are far greater priorities than the small percentage of those illegal immigrants that are involved in crime. And you're best to address those in a holistic way, as opposed to driving around and looking for folks that might vaguely resemble the description of someone who might be, and causing the kind of disruption, fear, and intimidation in communities. So it's hard to believe that it's not deliberate and meant to be message sending as opposed to actually be a public safety operation.
Right. Absolutely. Well, that is all that I have for you. Thank you very, very much for coming back on and talking about ICE. You know, was it this week that they announced that they're withdrawing from Minneapolis? But this is not the end. Like, this is not the end. There will be another city that comes soon. So I think it's still important to be ringing the alarm about this and speaking to truth what they are doing and being able to create a plan for what comes next. Like identify what we're seeing.
Yes. And this may have a direct relationship to how they might deploy around elections. And that has been intimated. It might be a dress rehearsal for it. And those are the things that I think are really critical in thinking about what liberty, what freedom, what the ability of self-determination and participation in a democracy really means. And anything that We don't want illegal voting anywhere, but we want to not do things that suppress legitimate voting. And it does feel like that is what this administration is messaging around and demonstrating that it has the capability of doing. So this is going to be a critical moment. And I think that Congress has to stand up and not be willing to continue to fund things that ancillarily support this kind of behavior.
Right. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much.
You bet.
I wish you the best of luck in the next 3 or 4 weeks until primary day. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
You got it. You be well, and thanks for what you're doing.
Yep. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of Current Affairs Unfiltered. I hope you guys liked my second round interview with Phil Andrew. He's always a pleasure to talk to. So smart, so well-spoken, and truly just the nicest guy. And he's got a primary coming up on March 17th. So if you're in the Chicago area, if you're in Illinois, actually, early voting starts on March 2nd. And if you live in the city, it's already started. But be sure to go out and get your ballot. Or if you got it mailed, go ahead and fill that out. And otherwise, that's it. I'm wishing Phil the absolute best. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of Current Affairs. And I will be back next week with a guest episode. Last little Illinois candidate, for real this time, before the election. It's going to be a state house candidate named Ridge Knapp. He's running at Illinois 13. But yeah, and then we're back to mostly normal people with a few elections that happen later in the year thrown in there. But that's about it. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, leave a review, or share it with someone who could use this information. To support this podcast, you can also subscribe to my Substack, She Knows the Score, which is linked in the show notes. And as always, if you have questions, topic suggestions, or just want to say hi, you can find me on social media at Current Affairs Unfiltered Pod on Instagram, or send me an email at currentaffairs.unfilteredpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Keep asking questions, stay engaged, and don't forget to be a worthy Democrat. I will see you guys in a few weeks when I'm back from Dubai, but for real next week with a guest episode. And I will see you guys next week.